to bind off in pattern is something that you'll come across sometimes in your knitting if you are working ribbing or any other sort of a stitch that involves both knit and purl stitches. And what you'll want to do to work that sort of a bind off is you'll have a sense of your knitting, obviously, because you've been working that pattern, but it's really helpful if you're able to read your knitting so that you know what the next stitch is that you're going to be working. In my example, I've got a knit 3, purl 1 rib. So knit 3, purl 1, knit 3, purl 1, knit 3. And you can kind of tell, on the front it's a little bit hard, but you can see these are my rows, my columns of V's that make up my knit stitches. And kind of, in ribbing, if you give it a little tug, you can see that little valley right there. That's the column of purl stitches. And it's much easier to see on the back, actually. When you have a background of purl stitches, any single row of knits is going to stand out like a sore thumb. So these purl bumps are the purls, and then this column of V's, that is a line of knit stitches. So, what you will do to begin is work your stitch, whatever stitch it is, you're going to work it that way. Does that make sense? So if it's a knit stitch, you're going to knit it, and if it's a purl stitch, you're going to purl it. My first 3 stitches are knits, so I'll knit my first stitch, and I'll knit my second, and bind them off. If you're unfamiliar with binding off as a technique, I would recommend going back and taking a look at our How to Bind Off video. That will explain much slower and in more detail how to do just a standard bind off. So here I've worked my first 3 knit stitches, and I've bound them off all in knit, and I've come to my first purl stitch. And so what I'll do is bring my yarn forward and purl that guy, and then bind it off as usual. So pull that over the first stitch over the second stitch, and then bring the yarn back to the back because my next stitch is a knit stitch. So binding off in pattern, it may sound a little intimidating, but really it's exactly what it says. You're just going to knit your knit stitches and purl your purl stitches and bind off exactly like you normally would. It's just you're going to be combining the 2 methods of binding off. Come to another purl stitch, so I'll bring my yarn forward, purl that, bind that off, and then bring my yarn right back to the back because my next stitch is a knit. And that's all there is to binding off in pattern. Now the reason you'll want to do a bind off in pattern, especially for ribbing, instead of just knitting every stitch, is because it's going to provide you with a stretchier bind off. The purls in your bind off are going to continue providing you that elasticity that the ribbing itself has, so you can stretch that bind off as far as your ribbing can stretch. So that is the binding off in pattern.